welcome to Sarmaya Talks at Pundole's. I'm Aparna, and on behalf of the Sarmaya Arts Foundation, I'm delighted to have you all here today. I would like to take a moment to introduce ourselves. Sarmaya Arts Foundation is a not-for-profit organization that has a curated repository of art, artifacts, and living traditions from the Indian subcontinent. It was founded in 2015 by Paul Abraham, a Mumbai-based banker, history enthusiast, and arts patron. Our mission at Sarmaya is to make India's art, heritage, and culture more accessible and inspire young learners to discover their cultural inheritance through a critical and compassionate lens. We work on a hybrid programming model serving audiences both online and on the ground. I would like to now introduce our panelists for today. Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee is a Chancellor and Professor of History at Ashoka University, of which he was the founding Vice Chancellor. He was awarded a DPhil in Modern History by the University of Oxford. He has held visiting appointments at various prestigious educational institutions. He has authored many books. His recent book, Tagore and Gandhi, Walking Alone, Walking Together, won the Value of Words Award 2022 in non-fiction category. Dr. Shobita Punja has authored over 15 books, including Museums of India, Divine Ecstasy, The Story of Khajuraho, and Daughters of the Ocean, Discovering the Goddess Within. She has lectured on Indian art at various institutions and universities in India and abroad, and has worked with several cultural organizations. She has served as CEO of the National Culture Fund, Ministry of Culture, Government of India. Mr. Toby Sinclair has been working in India for the last 45 years. He has been involved in the production of wildlife, history, and cultural documentaries since 1995, and is a director at and Beyond Asia. He is a member of Ranthambore Foundation's Executive Committee and is a co-founder of the Responsible Tourism Society of India. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society, London, and received the Carl Zeiss Wildlife Conservation Award in 2007. He continues to be involved in conservation issues. And Mr. Paul Abraham is a banker with over 3 decades of experience. Paul believes the most meaningful way to preserve things that bring him joy, that is art, culture, and wildlife, is to pass on the flame. Through his philanthropic work, he has supported young historians, artists, and conservationists with fellowships, funding, and sustained patronage. Paul serves as the president of Hinduja Foundation and is the founder of Sarmaya Arts Foundation. Thank you. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Aparna. And good evening, everybody, and great to have you here physically, Professor and Toby. And Shobita was not keeping too well, so we requested her to come instead of completely, missing her presence. We said, why don't you come on Zoom? And she has graciously agreed, and so we have Shobita joining us today. So here's this book, and I'm going to kind of base most of my conversation today with the panelists on this book, and I would recommend all of you to get your copy. For me, this was an incredible new way of taking in the entire span of Indian history, told simply, but told with an expanse of time and topic which is unparalleled. I have not seen a history book like this, so if you want to gift anyone a book on Indian history, this is the recommended book to give. So that brings me to my first question. What brought you three together?
Lunch. Very simple.
No, to state the facts of the case, as it were. Shobita, Toby, and I have been friends from 1977-78. Shobita and I, in fact, even longer, 1974. And then Toby intruded and said he must be part of the trial. Our principal occupation, as Toby was saying just now, was to meet once a month at least for lunch. where we discussed, most of the time, we discussed books that we were reading, enjoying or not enjoying. And then all out of the blue during the COVID, 2020, I think, another friend, David Devidar, who runs Aleph Book Company, rang first me and then Shobita to say, look, you guys have been chattering and gossiping for God knows how many years. Why don't you stop that and write a book, both of you together? And we said, what book can we write? And then he suggested that we do something like this, the outcome of which is the new history of India. And the idea that David pitched to us was that we write a book where words, pictures, and maps would fuse together and create a kind of unique presentation of the history of India from its origins when it was formed as a geographical landmass to 2020. And the idea that the book would have pictures, but it wouldn't be a coffee table book, set us thinking. And that's when both Shobita and I thought that we should tap into a very unique archive that we knew existed. And that was Toby Sinclair's archive. Toby has been all over India. He has been to places which I cannot even pinpoint on the map of India. Toby knows more about the Indian countryside, Indian geography than I do. He is only white outside, he is brown inside, I can guarantee that. And so we said that instead of going to or buying from archives, photographic archives that exist, like say the Getty collection or something like that, why don't we use Toby's photographs? It's never been used before. Toby, except for a handful of people, nobody even knew that Toby had an archive like this of 60,000 or more slides. And we said we'll get in Toby and he will select and provide the pictures and become the third author of the book. Well, that's roughly how the book originated.
Okay, so let me ask you another question. The book touches upon many things, and that's a departure from the typical history book. I mean, you talk about the evolution of religions, the schools of theology, languages, trade and payment mechanisms, relationship with the environment, and evolution of the arts and aesthetic sensibilities. So did you feel the need to expressly touch upon these issues and take it differently?
Sorry, I didn't get that. What issues?
All these issues, which are not typical to a history book, you know. Why did you feel the need to kind of include the entire expanse?
So, the obvious answer to that is that we didn't want it to be a typical history book. We wanted it to be unusual. And as the name of the book indicates, we wanted it to be something that was novel, something that had never been done before. So that's why we took this approach. I think this is the right place to bring in Shobita, because many of the ideas that are there in the book, the unusual ideas, actually came from her. So Shobita, if you can hear us and see us, would you like to address this issue that Paul has raised? She can hear only. Sorry? Oh, I see. Okay, so what we did, because we were aiming at some kind of newness or novelty, we tried to be as comprehensive as is possible within a book of this length, which wouldn't turn out to be too boring or too long and wouldn't tax the muscles when you lift the book. So that was the kind of motivation.
Yeah, it's because it adds a fascinating color to the book, because for me, typically a history book is very timeline based. It's only dynasties moving from one to the other and all of that. Here, it's, talking about all the other, allied areas, and combined with the visuals, which you provided, and the specific boxed writings, which I think Shobita did. It's a fascinating way to navigate the pages as we go along. So how did you feel about joining this project with your visual archive as a chronicler, visual chronicler?
I think it gave me an opportunity to try and sort things out a bit. All my digital stuff is quite well archived, but I have boxes and boxes of unsorted slides. And that was fun, actually, going back to look for pictures of Cambodia or Indonesia and Pakistan, which we could include in the book because it's part of the story. And an important part of sort of Rudrangshu's text. And I think to actually go back one step, something you mentioned, the book has a chronological narrative, but dropped into it are these chapters, as you said, the influence of Islam or India and the world, and they needed illustrating, and that sort of stretched my memory a bit. But I think we managed to find something which is suitable. The nice thing is that the images don't always just illustrate the paragraph or the section of the chapter which precedes it or follows it. In a sense, they are an independent set of images, and the text that Shobita, the captions that Shobita then weaved in. So there is this three sort of layers: images, Rudrangshu's main text, and those boxes and captions. So they complement each other. And the other thing about the book is that you can read it from beginning to end, but you can also just dip in and read a chapter. They are, in a sense, standalone chapters, and they work. I believe. I mean, that's what Rudrangshu put together, and we all read and reread and reread over an 18-month period. To go back to your question, the images, I think it took a lot longer than Shobita wanted to find them all, but we got there in the end.
One interesting fact, I mean, the book was written when we were under lockdown because of COVID. So Shobita was in Delhi in her home, I was in Calcutta in my home. Toby most of the time was in his home in Delhi, then he moved to London. So, we actually physically did not meet while we were writing the book. Then after the whole thing was done, the text had been written, the captions, the boxes had been written, the pictures had been chosen, put in their proper places, and we knew what the pages would look like. It's only then, in November 21, I think, October, November 21, that the three of us met for two very, very intensive sessions spread over 4, 5 days, 6 days in fact, where we read the text together, everything, the pictures, the captions, the chapters, and then sort of very critically, and then decided whether the chapters, the pages were saying exactly what we wanted to say. I mean, in that sense, this was a very unique mode of writing where the three authors did not actually meet. So it was a new collaboration for a new history.
Wonderful. Okay, so coming down to the actual history context for this book. In your perception, Indian history, at least on the broader themes, are we well covered, or do you feel there are still significant gaps?
Yes, there are very significant gaps, I think, on which research and resources are still inadequate to arrive at very firm conclusions. For example, just to take an example from the top of my head, I mean, we still don't know why the Harappan cities and Harappan civilization disappeared.
Yeah.
And what it was, so far as we know, maybe new kinds of evidence will produce something very startling. The next phase of known history is not an urban phase at all. It is a pastoral agricultural phase, what in shorthand historians refer to as the age and society of the Vedic period. So just to take an example, I mean, this is a major gap. We are struggling with it to find explanations about the disappearance and why, in fact, there's a retrogression, in fact, from urbanization to pastoralism. Normally, in historical evolution, it's the other way around. We move from pastoralism to urbanization.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of our pastoral to urban movement and the creation of the Janapadas, started that process at both ends, right?
Yes.
Before and after.
Before and after.
Which is strange.
And then of course there are regional gaps as well. We tried to plug one of those regional gaps by breaking the chronological narrative and introducing a chapter on the Northeast, which is very seldom covered
Yes.
in any general history book of covering India. But there are other gaps. I mean, I would have liked if I had the ability, we would have liked if we had the ability to write a little more, say, on Odisha, which is other than Ashoka's conquest of Kalinga and the famous 13th edict that he issued. We do not know very much about, and then the building of Konarak, of course, we don't know very much about the internal history of Orissa and how it was influenced by historical currents in other parts of India. So, these are gaps, and that's why history is a living subject. I mean, the conventional notion is the past is dead. I think sometimes provocatively, I often say, and actually I believe that the past is more alive than the present.
Yeah. In fact, there is always this question about, is Mohenjo-daro and Harappa the oldest we've gone? I mean, in terms of organized urban settlements, or all these mounds which are being dug up now, Raki Gadi, Agroha, and all of these, are we going further back, or are we?
I mean, I'm sure these discoveries, as they proceed, will bring about major chronological changes about the phase and the extent of the Harappan civilization. And of course, the really big mystery is the script.
Yeah.
Once that script is deciphered, a whole new world will completely open up.
Yeah.
We know nothing about that script except that it was written from the right to left.
Yeah. In fact, I have that as a question later in a rapid fire for you, whether we will have a Rosetta moment of our own in India. From the book, broadly, it's prehistory, the formation of the landmass and all of that. Then there is the pastoral to agricultural processes. Then the beginnings of empire with the Magad Empire. And then, of course, the rest, You and Shobita took charge of, hi. Shobita is there, I think.
Can she hear us now?
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us, Shobita? We
No.
can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. So, did you find that each era had enough visual material to document?
I didn't have enough coverage on many of the places. So I mean, we raided ASI archives for Rakhigarhi, for example, the excavations, also the excavations in Kashmir. And I went back into the museum where I had, in New Delhi, where I had photographed before, and photographed quite a few items in glass cases, pottery. So there are many of the items in the illustrations of the book are ones that I took, but I took for the book in the museum. So there's that was sort of the only original photography in one sense. But luckily, living in Delhi, we had access to it.
All right.
So I didn't have that before. I had archaeological, I mean, whether it's Lothal or other Indus sites, Harappan sites, I've been to and photographed them before, but didn't have enough.
Not just Harappa, Toby, I think you were sort of kind of typically underestimating your contribution to this book. I mean, you know, pictures of South Indian culture, South Indian temples, proliferate in the book, and they all come from your personal archive.
They do. I think Shobita felt that I was giving her 30 images when she actually only wanted one. She wanted to make the decision. She wanted me to make some decisions or give her a shorter list. I would give a selection because initially we weren't sure actually how it was going to evolve. And eventually a lot of the final decisions on we'll have this photograph rather than that one were done sitting down with Shobita.
No.
Rudrangshu sort of rather left us to that, but it was collaborative at all levels. The maps as well, for example.
And I think our nearly 50-year-long friendship helped the process of collaboration. I think I can't recall offhand where there were moments of discord about what we wanted to say about India's past. I mean, we have discussed this so many times and at such length that we were constantly on the same page.
So 2-3 weeks ago we had Nayanjot here, you know, and one of the things she focused on was the entire, you know, universe of sources in constructing a story. So it's not just the monumental or necessarily literature, oral history, etc., inscriptions. Everything plays a part, right? So in the beginning, there's a phase where a lot of our history is inferenced, so to speak, from the Vedas and the Upanishads and all of that. So how did that process go? How do you kind of extract stuff from?
So these quote-unquote scriptural texts written from, say, 1200 BCE to 700, 600 BCE. That's the time frame for, you know, it's not as if you're just writing about a very small period. Now, often if you read those, what are supposed to be chants, mantras, they are actually telling you something about the society from which these chants have emerged. So, for example, I mean, this is a common sense conclusion. So many chants in the Rig Veda, particularly in the Rig Veda, are actually concerned with light. Either it is the sun or it is Agni, fire that is providing the light. I mean, the greatest known verse from the Rig Veda, the Gayatri, is about the dawn, the rising of the sun. Just a passing aside, sorry for this digression, I mean, uh, this will sound a bit sacrilegious, but there is nothing sacred about the Gayatri. I mean, it is in praise of a new dawn, the rise of the sun. And why is it called Gayatri? Because the rhythm structure of that particular verse, which is somewhat unique in the Rig Veda, was given the name Gayatri. That's why it's called the Gayatri mantra, because of the rhythmic structure, for no other reason. Now, so here are people, it's common sense conclusion, as I said, that who are completely exposed to and at the mercy of nature. So when darkness falls, when the sun disappears, they are frightened, they are insecure. And then when the light returns, they find it awesome and something that should be welcomed, if not worshipped. So the conclusion is that these are people on the move, they are pastoral people, and they are obviously in awe of nature. So that tells us something about that society. Similarly about fire. Fire provides warmth, and these are people who are inhabiting what is today Punjab, parts near Kabul, and probably Haryana, cold parts of the year, large parts of the year. It provides warmth and also provides protection from wild animals. These are all heavily, densely forested areas at that point of time. So, protection from wild animals. So, again, verse after verse, praising Agni, who is seen as a protector, who is seen as the source of light, seen as the source of warmth as well. So, again, it tells us something about the kinds of life they're living in, the kinds of geography that they're inhabiting.
Okay, so again...
And again, the Vedic literature, not just the 4 Vedas, has another group of prose, largely prose, written in prose, 90% written in prose, which are called the Aranyakas. So, Aranya is the forest. It actually indicates how close the forest was.
Yeah.
You could walk into the forest to retreat, to have a life of meditation and solitude if you felt too pressurized about hunting, gathering, cultivating. You just retreat into the forest. It was very easy to do. I mean, you wouldn't have to drive to Bandhavgarh, as Mr. Sinclair often does, for 5, 6, 7 hours from Delhi, but you could just walk there. And these Aranyakas are treatises, prose treatises that were written by people who were living in the forest for part of the time. Again, the proximity of the forest, I find that fascinating, absolutely. Yeah. Probably I find it fascinating because the forest has retreated. I mean, it's become a part of Indian exotica. I mean,
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We want some of it back, seriously. Okay, I'm going to ask you a few generic questions to set at rest some ideas which always cause confusion. The history of language in India, we always have these big debates about Sanskrit, Pali, Kharoshti, Brahmi, Tamil. Give us a sense of how this evolved.
Language is fundamental to human existence. Let's begin with that statement, because human beings communicate through sounds. Then somebody systematizes those sounds, gives them alphabetical form, out of which a language is born. Now, so the people of India, we don't know, for example, what the Harappan people spoke. And we, by the way, we will never be able to know how the Harappan people spoke, even when we have deciphered the script, because we will not be able to ever capture the sounds that those letters conveyed. Okay? We can read it. We will be able to read it. I'm sure we'll be able to read it in our own lifetime. But we will never know the language. We'll never, because we will never know the sounds associated with the letters. Okay? So people who inhabited prehistoric or ancient India spoke to each other. Okay? Originally might have been through grunts, okay, but finally they did speak. Now, on this fundamental layer of communication, somewhere around 1200, 1300 BCE, there evolves this language called Sanskrit, which is the language of the scriptures, which is the language of the learned, and the language of the scribes, who either listened to or originally listened to and then began to take notes of what was being said. But that was not the language of the common people. The common people spoke their own languages, of which Pali was one. Magadhi Pali, the most common language, is one. So there is a term called Prakrit as opposed to Sanskrit, Prakrit. Now Prakrit is a hold-on. It consists of all dialects and languages that were not Sanskrit. Okay? And out of Prakrit, these very regional articulations that we know as the regional languages emerge. So all these languages, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu, Malayali, Marathi, in Bombay you have to say that, emerged out of an early form of Prakrit. And some of them had original names, just like I said, Magad Pali. And it is, and some of these languages deliberately, very self-consciously differentiated itself from the Sanskrit. So when Gautama is talking about piety, he himself says, I'm talking about Dhamma. He doesn't say, I'm talking about Dharma, because Dhamma is the Magadha Pali version or the Prakrit version of Dharma. So he's deliberately, self-consciously saying, I'm not talking to you scriptural people. I'm talking to the common people who understand my language. So there is a, I would say there's a social distinction. Language is also a reflection of the social distinction that existed at that point of time. Let me give you a very, very telling example from the Mahabharata. A classic Sanskrit text. It's part of our Sanskrit heritage. Okay? Now, there is only one place in the Mahabharata where Prakrit intrudes into a Sanskrit epic. It occurs in the Adi Parva. The Pandavas, they're still not married. The 5 brothers and their mother, Kunti, have been persuaded by Dhritarashtra that there's too much intrigue and discord going on in court. Why don't you go into the forest? My son has built a mansion for you. You will live there in comfort. And once tempers have come down, you will come back. Now what Dhritarashtra doesn't know, because he's blindly trusting of his son, is that that mansion is built out of incendiary material, and Duryodhana plans to put a match to it or light a fire and get that mansion destroyed when the Pandavas are sleeping. So, the 5 brothers and their mother decide, and they're leaving Hastinapur, a forlorn sextet, if you like. With them is going the youngest brother of Dhritarashtra, Vidura. And where Hastinapur ends and the forest begins, Vidura turns to the group and says, now I'm going to take my leave and go back. And then he speaks to Yudhishthira. Okay? When he's gone, Kunti turns to Yudhishthira and says, what did Deva, my brother-in-law, say to you? None of us understood a single word that he said. Vidura spoke to Yudhishthira deliberately in Prakrit to warn him that this is the conspiracy. This is what they plan to do to you, and I will send you a messenger at the appropriate time, and you do what he tells you to do, because he will be my man. So, see how interesting that, the interesting way in which Prakrit is made to play a very critical role in saving the Pandavas at the intervention of Vidura, who, mind you, very interesting. Vidura is the embodiment of dharma, and Yudhishthira is the son of dharma. And both the embodiment of dharma and the son of dharma know Prakrit. The only two people in the entire Mahabharata, they know Prakrit.
Well, in fact, Ashokan edicts typically had 2 languages, right?
Yeah, so that's what I should have mentioned the other point. Not only is there a variety of languages, there's also a variety of scripts. So many of Ashoka's, or most of Ashoka's edicts are written in Prakrit, but are written in the Brahmi script. That's why it took so long for them to be decoded and deciphered, because nobody knew the Brahmi script.
Yeah.
The Brahmi script had completely disappeared.
Yeah, and it also has.
And we have a very good, Shobita wrote a very, very good section on Prinsep, the man who deciphered the Brahmi script.
And it also gives us a sense of the ethnic mix around what was then, known India, because the westernmost edict that was discovered in what is present-day Pakistan, Afghanistan region, northwest, was Greek and Aramaic.
Aramaic, yes. Very interesting.
Yeah. So,
Aramaic is, as most of you know, the language of the New Testament and parts of the Old Testament as well.
yeah. Supposedly the language Jesus spoke.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we come down a little towards, say, the 300, 500 AD period, and then we see a big flowering of philosophical thought. In the book you mentioned 6 schools of philosophy, and they provided not only differences in thought, but the ability to debate. You actually had places where you could debate, and it was formally provided for. And so what brought about that? What was special about that period that allowed for this flowering?
Well, it actually starts earlier. It starts earlier with that remarkable individual called Gautama Buddha, who is one of the earliest dissenters to this world of Vedic scriptures and Vedic learning. And he completely shifts, if I may use the phrase, completely shifts the terms of discourse. Because what Buddha is saying is, if I may sort of simplify, is he's saying it is not important to discuss whether God exists or not. Okay? The existence of God is not a critical question for human beings. What is a critical question for human beings is how do we lead a good life? Good, moral, ethical life, irrespective of whether God exists or not. This is a completely new question that is being asked. And Buddha actually, and now thanks to the scholarship of a major Sanskritist called Richard Gombrich, we know that Gautama, before he attained enlightenment, was an Upanishadic scholar. He read and learned the Upanishads at the feet of at least more than one guru. So he's actually drawing from some of the lesser emphasized legacies of the Upanishad, which emphasize discussion, argumentation, meditation also. Reflexivity. Think about yourself, think about your life. I mean, so this is what's happening. If you're thinking about yourself, you're also thinking about your relationship with other human beings, because you do not exist by yourself. And this is what leads to the opening up of the intellectual horizon, and people begin to talk and begin to discuss things. And then society provides a space for such discussion. Kautuhalashalas,
Yes.
they were called. And, you know, major human settlements, all the big human settlements, at least had one assembly or hall like this where people could meet and talk. And also, you know, often not emphasized, this is a period of mobility. Traders, monks, they're all moving across India, the geography of India. Now, they're not just carrying commodities, even if they're traders. They're also carrying ideas. You know, I was in place A few weeks ago, and in the Kautuhalashala of that place, they were talking about the non-existence of God. Can you think about it? You know, he's narrating it in place B, where he has just traveled.
Yeah.
So this is how the mobility also contributes to the mobility of ideas.
Yeah. So, you know, just one more question before we get to the, you know, the arrival of Islam. Oh, Shobita is on, but can we see her? Can you hear us now? Yeah? Great. Oh, gosh. We had her talk again, listening absolutely fine, and suddenly, you know, it's Parkinson's.
Anyway,
Murphy's
carry
law.
on. Let it.
Yeah, so just one question before the arrival of Islam.
The perils of technology.
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, when you talk about the period thereafter, because of all of this evolution of philosophical thought and the evolution of schools of, you know, religion, etc., when you talk about the period, say 600 to 1000 odd, before Islam seriously arrives on the scene, the scene of action shifts a little south, where all the big dynasties and empires, you know, the Chalukyas, the, you know, Rashtrakutas, the Hoysalas, and the Cholas down south, and all of that. And a lot of that division is also versions of religion, you know, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Buddhism, Jainism, they are all, you know, and even within the dynasty, one king is patronizing Shaivism, another suddenly switches to Vaishnavism. So it's an amazing, you know, period of flux. In fact,
I always like to think of the Indian tradition and the Indian civilization as a kind of a churning pot. all the time we are thinking of different ideas, being influenced by different ideas, and it doesn't matter where they come from.
Yeah. So it's almost 500-600 years of action in central India, in the Deccan area. And oftentimes when we talk history, we are so consumed by what happened in the north, we forget this, and it's a period of great evolution. And that brings me to the question, the visible history associated with the south is usually with places of worship. Some of the most fantastic temple structures, whether it is in, Badami, Aihole, down south in Brihadeshwara, even in the Rashtrakutas in Ellora, the Kailash temple. Do you see that the south was very distinct visually than the north when you saw visible history?
I think throughout the country, but in the south in particular, the places of worship are within a landscape, and that landscape is very important. Whether you look at Hampi, whether you look at Ellora, the Kailasha, cave number 16, whether you look at Badami, the landscape is part of the caves, of course, but not only caves. The temples they merge into the landscape, or they come out of the landscape in the case of Hampi. I don't think you can separate one from the other.
But the south seemed to have far more of this,
Orissa has?
I think,
Orissa has phenomenal cave structures and carvings which come out of hillsides.
So I think the obsession to build forts and palaces was not as much as the obsession to build fantastic temples.
Making a different statement, but maybe that's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so...
Paul, since you are talking about this period of churn that has a south dimension, it's also important to remember that it is in this period in particular that the gods that Hindus worship presently, Shiva, Vishnu, forms of Shakti, if I can reduce them to these two. It's in this period that these gods and goddesses emerge. There is no mention of Vishnu in the entire Vedic scriptural literature. Okay? There is no mention of Shiva in the entire Vedic scriptural literature. There is mention of Rudra, which scholars have argued, particularly the famous American scholar Stella Kramrisch, who taught in Tagore's University in Shantiniketan, that Rudra is actually an early form of Shiva. And Shakti is, of course, much later. So it's interesting how we claim to say that the Vedas are the fountainhead of Hinduism, but the gods that we worship as Hindus are not in the Vedas.
Yeah, fascinating.